Question number 3, James Shaw.
My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, I do.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does he stand by his statement that New Zealand is not a tax haven because, quote, New Zealand has full disclosure of information, end quote, when it comes to foreign trusts?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
If New Zealand has full disclosure of information, why does the Antipodes Trust Group describe New Zealand Foreign Trust as offering limited reporting requirements where the identity of the settler and the beneficiaries need not be disclosed?
Order. No, again, we've just transgressed into exactly the territory in before. The member wants to order. If the member wants to ask a question about full disclosure, do so. But don't use the question to pry into any member's return of pecuniary interests. Further supplementary?
A point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, last week we had questions in the House about statements on websites by other law firms that were offering services to people to set up foreign trusts in New Zealand. These organisations like Covisory Group and so on are very similar to Antipodes Trust Group. I don't see why we should exclude Antipodes Trust Group from the same line of questioning as we had last week, just because the Prime Minister has an account with them.
Because I suggest then the members refer to the two Speakers' rulings that I gave. Speakers' ruling 1721 and 1714. They describe quite adequately the role of the Prime Minister in answering questions. It's not an opportunity for members to use questions to any minister to then pry into the register of pecuniary interests. Further supplementaries? I've ruled on the matter. I'll allow the member to rephrase his question so that it's in line with standing orders.
Well, sorry, point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I've ruled on the matter. If it's a fresh point of order, I'm very keen to hear it. But if it's in any way, again, just disagreeing with the decision I've made.
No, I'm seeking clarification.
Well, that's really not the point of order, the purpose of a point of order.
So I actually...
Listen, the way forward, and I've given the member an opportunity, move quickly to a question, rephrase it in a way that it meets my requirements. James Shaw, supplementary question.
So I'm rephrasing the question then?
I'm giving the member the opportunity, and rather than ruling it out, I'm giving the member...
Does he agree with Antipodes Trust Group that New Zealand foreign trusts offer limited reporting requirements where the identity and settler of the beneficiaries need not be disclosed?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I'd need to see that statement in the context of all the other positions.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he also agree, or does he agree with Antipodes Trust Group that potential foreign investors are available to use their services because client information is kept strictly confidential?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not for me to comment on the advertising of a particular private sector company.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Has he spoken to anybody at the Antipodes Trust Group in the last 2 weeks?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister, insofar as there's Prime Ministerial responsibility. Insofar as there is.
Mr. Speaker, not in terms of Prime Ministerial responsibility, no.
Order.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Supplementary question. So does he agree that it is correct that client information is kept strictly confidential?
Again, I can't see how that relates in any way to the Prime Ministerial responsibility.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
I'm simply extending a line of questioning started by my colleague Gillian Genter last week about that the Prime Minister said that there were a number of law firms that were incorrect in their statements on their website. I'm just trying to determine whether
if the member wants to rephrase the question in a way that satisfies me, I'll give him an opportunity.
So does the Prime Minister stand by his responses to questions last week that law firms, including Antipodes Trust Group, Advisory Group and so on, are incorrect in the statements that they make on their websites in relation to foreign trust law in New Zealand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I wasn't asked about that particular firm last week.
Question number 4. Oh, point of order. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Shaw put a generic category of firms and then include Antipodes. The answer came back from the Prime Minister, I wasn't asked about that particular firm last week. Now that cannot be the answer to a question that included more than that firm, as Mr Shaw put it.
I will hear from the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member made an assertion about a particular firm and said that that was what his colleague had asked me last week. She did not ask me that last week.
And that is the answer that was given.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Do you think it matters, does he think it matters whether or not New Zealand fits the legal definition of a tax haven if it is being marketed as one or used by people from overseas as one, regardless of its legal definition as a tax haven?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, New Zealand is not a tax haven. In fact, I had a discussion with the Inland Revenue Commissioner this morning about exactly that point, and she confirmed to me as well, New Zealand is not a tax haven.
Speaker, point of order.
Order. Order. Point of order, James Shaw. Order. Order. I have a point of order from James Shaw.
My question was not whether or not he thought that New Zealand was a tax haven, it was whether it mattered whether it was thought of as a tax haven by people
And again,
overseas.
the question in my mind was addressed, particularly when I refer to Speaker's Ruling 1913 and 4. When you ask a very general question like that as a primary, you've got to allow some latitude and then subsequent supplementary questions and the answers that might be given. Question number 4, Alistair Scott.